Adult Sunday School Leader. I hope you're having a great week so far. Hey, at the end of this video, I'm going to correct a mistake that I made a couple of weeks ago, but let's look first at this week's lesson. Before we had cell phones, our family came up with this way to signal each other when we're inside a store. You know how it is. You're at the end of one aisle, and you see a family member at the other end of the aisle, and you want to get their attention, but you don't want to yell, "Hey!" You know, that would just be a little bit too embarrassing, wouldn't it? I don't remember how we came up with this, but we signaled with a clearing of the throat. And even to this day, when we're in Walmart and I'm trying to get my wife's attention and she's half an aisle away, all I have to do is, and she stops and looks for me because she knows my clearing. She knows my voice. So when we're in the store and I do that, only my wife and daughter know it's me. But when Jesus returns, everyone will know it's him. There will be no doubt. That's what we're looking at this week as we continue in the unit, Christ's Return, living with the end in mind. We're in Lesson 3, Watch for Christ's Return, out of Matthew 24, verses 23 through 31. The point of this lesson is, when Christ returns, everyone will know it. Well, this week we're picking up in the next verse right after where we left off last week. And I really like these kind of studies that examine an entire passage over a period of several weeks, because you get a better feel for the context of the passage instead of pulling bits and pieces from various parts of Scripture. Well, as we look in Matthew 24, verses 23 through 26, Jesus warned his listeners not to believe anyone who says, "The Messiah is over here," or "Come with me to see the Christ." He stated this back at the beginning of this chapter in verses 4 and 5. Don't believe it. It won't be me. Even if you see them perform miracles, don't be fooled. Now, at the first advent of Christ, when he first came to earth, into this world as a little baby, it was without much fanfare. His birth was announced only to a few people. But at his return, there's going to be no doubt that the conquering king has returned. It won't be like it was when Jesus was about 30 years old. We can see in John chapter 1, verses 40 and 42, when Andrew told his brother Peter, "We have found the Messiah. Come and see." No, there won't be any need for any introductions. There's going to be signs leading up to it, increasing in number and intensity as birth pains. But there's not going to be any need for, "The Messiah's over here. Let's go meet him." None of that is going to be needed. Now, in every generation, there have been people who claim to be Jesus Christ. And just in my lifetime, there have been several notable cases. You'll probably recognize most of these names. Sun Myung Moon, Jim Jones, Marshall Applewhite of Heaven's Gate cult, David Koresh, who called himself the sinful Messiah, and Charles Manson. And one you may not have heard of, unless you live in South Carolina, is Todd Kincannon. He was a Southern Baptist and a former head of the South Carolina Republican Party. He was arrested in 2018 for killing and mutilating his mother's dog, claiming he was the second coming of Jesus and God told him to do it. Well, you can Google people who have claimed to be Christ and find many others over the centuries who have done so. Now, I believe that those who claim to be Jesus fall into one of four different categories. Those who intentionally set out to deceive and intend to profit either monetarily or just egotistically from the claim. Those who are mentally ill, those who are demon-possessed, and fourth, possibly some combination of the previous three. Well, Jesus told his listeners in verse 25 that he has told them ahead of time. Okay? Don't be fooled. I'm warning you ahead of time. I'm warning you. Therefore, you're not going to, and we're not going to have any excuse if we fall for this. So how do we keep ourselves from being deceived? I think Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 18 really spells it out well. This is the passage about putting on the full armor of God. And verse 11 of that passage tells us why to put it on, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. Getting someone to follow a false Messiah is definitely a scheme of the devil, so get your armor on. Now, in verses 27 through 29 of our lesson text, Jesus used two events that happened in nature as analogies, and some others as signs of his coming. Now, we have done a lot of driving in northwest Oklahoma at night. We're going to visit my wife's relatives. And to drive in a lightning storm in that part of the country is pretty neat. you can see a storm for miles, miles away. And in a split second, the lightning that starts in one part of the sky immediately streaks across the sky and lights up the whole area. That's how Jesus' coming will be. Just like 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 52 states, in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye will be the Lord's return. It'll be quick, but unmistakable. And then there's a statement in verse 28 about vultures. And you think, what is that about? Where there's a carcass, the vultures will gather. Where is that coming from? Well, there's numerous interpretations about this verse, dealing with dealing with the invasion of the Roman army in AD 70, circling like vultures around a dying Jerusalem. Others state that Jesus' return will be one of judgment on the false messiahs and unbelievers. And that interpretation has a little bit of merit when you read Revelation 19, especially down to the last verse, verse 21, that mentions birds gorging themselves on the flesh of the wicked. I tend to take a simpler interpretation. Okay, we're walking along, we're driving along, and you see vultures circling overhead. What does that tell you? Immediately, you know without a doubt what? There's something dead or dying below, right? Similarly, when you see these signs that have been mentioned, just like you see vultures, when you see the signs, you're going to know without a doubt that Christ has returned. That's my interpretation. Now, in verse 29, it mentions about the signs in the sky. And these don't appear to be analogies, but real events that will happen. The sun and moon won't shine, stars fall from the sky, heavenly bodies will be shaken. Now, I can understand how skeptics, maybe 100 years ago or so, might not understand how this could ever happen. But with the advent of atomic bombs, it becomes clear how that might actually happen. Well, early in the 20th century, Jehovah's Witnesses predicted that Jesus was returning in 1914. And when that didn't happen, they revised their claim and said that Jesus' second coming was spiritual, and he began ruling in heaven at that time. Well, make no mistake, there won't be anything silent or doubtful about Jesus' return. It will be worldwide, and just like the point of the lesson states, when Jesus returns, everyone will know it. Before we get into the last section, let's read another verse. Verse Acts 1:11. And here there are two angels, and they're speaking to Jesus' disciples, and those disciples had just seen Jesus ascend into heaven. And here's what the angel said. Men of Galilee, they said, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. Well, now let's look at verses 30 and 31 of Matthew 24. What the angel said would happen is how Jesus will return. He will return from the sky just as he was taking up into the sky. And it mentions about the nations mourning. Why will they mourn? Well, it's because at that instant, they will realize we've been on the wrong side. The believers we rejected, mocked, ridiculed, even persecuted, they were right. Jesus' second coming, it won't be as a humble baby or a carpenter, but a mighty, powerful king. So don't be fooled by fancy words or even miraculous events performed by someone claiming to be Jesus. When Jesus does return, there will be no introduction needed and no doubt. And now for my correction from a couple of weeks ago. In the first lesson of this series, where I talked about the size of the temple, I said that the temple compound covered about 37 acres, which was hard for me to visualize, and then I likened it to the size of about 50 football fields. One of the men in my class is a farmer and a former baseball player who actually made it to the minor leagues several years back, so he knows a bit about sports fields and acreage. And when I made that statement, he's kind of a quiet guy. He just kind of sat there and shook his head, and I said, what's wrong? He said, well, that's just not right. So he explained that there are 43,500 square feet in an acre, and then including the end zones, there are 57,600 square feet on a football field. And so 37 acres would translate to fewer football fields than 50, more like 28. What I did is I divided the wrong number into the wrong number. So I should have done that instead of that. So anyway, there's your correction. So I like to correct myself whenever I make mistakes, and you feel free to do the same thing to me. That's all I have for this week. Thank you guys very much for watching. Don't forget to pray for and with your class this week.